Deep in the Roman catacombs, we find one of the earliest images of Jesus performing a miracle. It's a fresco in the so-called Catacomb of Domitilla, dating from the late 3rd century, and it shows a famous story from the Gospel of John, when Jesus raises his friend Lazarus from the dead. Jesus is standing before the tomb, arm extended, and in his hand is a slim stick, a wand, if you will, and with it he points it toward the tomb as Lazarus rises to life. And this is not a one-off image. Across early Christian art, from paintings like this one to carved sarcophagi, Jesus is shown again and again holding a stick while working his miracles. So what are we seeing here? Is this really a magic wand portraying Jesus as a magician, or does this mean something completely different? The scholar of religion Lee Jefferson wrestles with this very question in his article The Staff of Jesus in Early Christian Art, where he argues that these images do not depict Jesus as a magician at all. But to understand why, we need to first situate these images into their historical contexts. To us today, a wand is not a neutral object. We have been conditioned through centuries of folklore and decades of pop culture to view the wand as the quintessential tool of the magician, an object that signals instantly that magic is about to happen. Whether we're talking about pop culture tropes like fairy godmothers transforming pumpkins into carriages, or real-world ritual practices like what we see with contemporary witchcraft, the wand carries unmistakably magical connotations. The question is, for the ancient viewer looking at this painting, did this stick have the same connotation? Was a wand a part of the magic worker's kit? But here we need to be nuanced. When I say magic worker's kit, it's very hard to separate our understanding of magic from literary stereotypes of magicians, our own modern fantasy and pop culture understanding of wizards, witches, and sorcerers. But in the ancient world, there were ritual specialists who were experts in rituals that, for better or for worse, have been called magic. People who made amulets, inscribed curse tablets, or recited protective spells. They were not calling themselves magicians, though. Magos, the ancient word that's so often translated as magician, was more often used as a pejorative term used to accuse someone of practicing illegitimate or deviant ritual. The people actually practicing what we call magic in antiquity were not magicians in the sense of someone with an identifiable social role that marked them out as a professional wonder worker. They were scribes who copied protective incantations onto papyrus, metal workers who created bronze amulets for their customers, or gem cutters who carved protective images onto stones. Their tools were chisels, ink, and styluses, not wands. And sometimes they were not artisans at all, but religious functionaries like monks or rabbis who turned their religious training in scripture and liturgy toward more down-to-earth ritual practices. For example, check out late antique incantation bowls. These are ordinary clay bowls discovered in Mesopotamia, inscribed on the inside with spiraling lines of text meant to trap or expel demons from a household. Hundreds of these have been found, many written in Jewish Aramaic, and draw their formulas directly from the Hebrew Bible or rabbinic literature. These were the work of literate experts embedded in local Jewish communities, producing ritual texts and familiar media. In other words, the so-called magicians of the ancient world looked more like scribes, artisans, monks, or rabbis working at a workbench rather than walking around brandishing a magic wand. So we need to separate these two layers, the folkloric or pop culture image of the wand-wielding magician and the much more ordinary social role of ritual experts in the ancient world. And in both cases, the short answer is no. Wands were not part of anyone's standard magical toolkit, nor would have instantly brought to mind magicians. That said, the ancient world had no shortage of ritual staffs, rods, sticks, or branches of various shapes and sizes, each used in different ritual contexts, some of which we might label magical insofar as these ritual contexts involved performing some sort of supernatural feat. So let's first investigate the social world of ritual experts before turning to the literary and mythological examples. In Greek, a staff was generally called a rhabdos, and in Latin, a lituus, baculum, or virga. Although the Greek versions implied a more flexible stick, while the Latin versions denoted something more rigid. In the Roman world, the lituus was the tool of augurs, religious administrators in ancient Rome who analyzed certain events in order to determine the will of the gods. The ancient Roman historian Livy wrote of one of these rituals when describing the coronation of Rome's legendary second king by means of augury. The augur seated himself on Numa's left, his head covered, and in his right hand he held a crooked staff without a knot, which they called a lituus. Then transferring the crook to his left hand and placing his hand on Numa's head, he prayed. The lituus would later go on to inspire the bishop's crozier in the Catholic Church. For Roman augurs, though, the lituus was more symbolic than functional, as in it was not used as an essential part of the divination process. So scholars like Dr. Jefferson argue that we can't reliably draw a direct line of influence between these staffs and the staff of Jesus in early Christian art. Now, staffs, or branches, or rods, or sticks do occasionally appear in some so-called magical texts, including a few from the Greek magical papyri. The Greek magical papyri is a collection of formulas composed roughly between the 2nd century BCE and the 5th century CE. But these texts were not produced by professional magicians. They were made by Hellenized Egyptian priests under Roman rule. Egyptian priests had long been specialists in ritual knowledge, and in this later period, their practices also involved compiling and adapting an enormous range of hymns, prayers, invocations, and ritual instructions, bringing them all into collections that were possibly consulted by other ritual experts. One of the clearest examples of a wand-like object in the Greek magical papyri comes from an invocation to the god Apollo. The practitioner is instructed to take a 7-leafed branch of laurel and hold it in your right hand as you summon the heavenly gods and chthonic daimons. Write on the sprig of laurel the 7 characters for deliverance. The text then lays out a very complicated ritual. Take a lamp, dress yourself in a prophetic garment, and hold an ebony staff in your left hand and the protective charm in your right, as in the laurel branch. So this text does feature a ritual stick. 2, in fact. The practitioner is told to hold an ebony staff in the left hand while holding a branch of laurel in the right. But this does not point to a wider culture of magicians using magic wands. It's one spell from one ritual handbook reflecting one very specific ritual context in late Roman Egypt. The staff here is unusual in the Greek magical papyri, and even then it's part of a much larger set of ritual paraphernalia. So while it's striking to see a stick appear in a magical ritual, this is the exception rather than the rule. Things get a bit trickier when we turn to ancient classical literature, where we see a few prominent examples of ritual staffs from mythological characters. For example, consider the god of healing Asclepius, who's often shown holding a bacteria, another Greek word for staff. This staff, usually with a snake wound around it, is still the symbol for the practice of medicine today. But Asclepius did not use it to channel his healing power. It was a marker of his identity. Asclepius was thought to heal through dreams, especially during a ritual called incubation. Devotees would sleep in his sanctuaries and hope that he would appear in a vision, and he would heal them through touch or a brief operation or prescribing a treatment. Inscriptions telling of his healing were set up in his sanctuaries praising his miraculous cures. The Greek god Hermes was almost always depicted with a staff in his hand, usually called a rhabdos in Homeric literature. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's a single rod that he uses to guide souls to the underworld and charm mortals into sleep. The Iliad says that with his rhabdos, he charms the eyes of whichever men he wishes and rouses them again when they have slumbered. Later, this staff becomes known as the carukion in Greek or the caduceus in Latin, recognizable today as a rod entwined with 2 snakes. The word itself derives from the Greek word for herald and reflects the staff's primary role as a symbol of a messenger's authority. By the Hellenistic and Roman periods, the caduceus had become his essential attribute in art, and it retained its association as a sleep-inducing staff. The Roman poet Ovid calls it his slumberous staff. Another famous ritual staff in the Greco-Roman world was the thorsus, the ivy-entwined wand carried by Dionysus and his ecstatic followers, the Maenads. Ancient authors describe it as a stalk of fennel wrapped in ivy vines or leaves. The cluster of leaves on the top sometimes look like a pine cone, though no ancient author actually says this. In his tragedy called the Bacchae, the Greek playwright Euripides highlights multiple functions of the thyrsus. In the play, the Maenads strike the ground with them and miraculously draw up wine, they strike rocks and water gushes forth, and they wield them kind of like weapons. He writes, the thursoi the women threw inflicted wounds, and the men ran, routed by the women. Elsewhere, the rods are described as dangerously powerful. You will all be routed, shamefully defeated, when their rods of ivy turn back your shields of bronze. So according to Euripides, the thyrsus could be considered an enchanted object for both wonder-working and destruction, though in general they also functioned as a symbol of Dionysus. So now we finally turn to the goddess Circe. In Book 10 of the Odyssey, Circe is described as wielding a rhabdos. She welcomes the companions of Odysseus into her hall, she gives them a feast laced with potions, and once they have drunk, Homer writes that she turns them into pigs by a stroke of her staff. Later retellings of this story give Circe's rod an even more prominent and tactile role. In Metamorphoses Book 14, Ovid describes Circe tapping Odysseus' crew on the foreheads, stroking their hair as she turns them into pigs with the help of her drugs. When Odysseus arrives, he confronts her. As she stretched her wand to stroke his hair, he struck it aside and drew his fearsome sword. Ovid reinforces this emphasis in the following episode when the legendary King Picus rejects Circe's romantic advances. Enraged by his rejection, she channels her power once again through her wand, transforming him into a woodpecker when she thrice tapped him with her wand and spoke 3 spells. And when Picus's men complain and demand their king's return, she turns her wand on them. She touched their awestruck faces with her wand. Its magic touch made monsters of them all. Lee Jefferson argues that in Homer and in these later Roman authors like Ovid, the true agent of transformation is not the wand, but the drugs. And he's not wrong that the drugs, or potions if we want to use that word, are an essential part of her wonder-working. Though I think he might be offering too narrow a reading. At least in Ovid's Metamorphoses, the drugs may trigger the transformation, but the wand is the instrument through which Circe ritualizes her control. The physical gesture transforms the ingestion of drugs into a public, visible act of power. In this sense, Homer and Ovid alike imagine enchantment as a multi-part process, both pharmacological and performative, the wand and the drugs working together to materialize ritual power. So before we turn back to the wand-wielding Jesus, where does this whole discussion leave us? In the historical and social world of the ancient Mediterranean, rods, staffs, or sticks do appear in a handful of ritual contexts, like Roman augury and that invocation from the Greek magical papyri that we looked at. But these were not universal markers of magic or part of a standardized magical toolkit in antiquity. The artisans who made amulets, the scribes who copied incantations, the rabbis who inscribed bowls to keep demons at bay, none of them were walking around with wands. And none of them were walking around calling themselves magicians. That's our own modern category we're trying to impose on ancient ritual practice. And in fact, they would have been offended if we said they were practicing magia or goetia, the catch-all terms for deviant, illegitimate ritual. Turning to the literary sources, we do see a wide range of ritual sticks. Figures like Hermes, Circes, and the Maenads all had such objects, and sometimes they're described as instruments of wonder-working, though ancient audiences would have understood clear categorical differences between all of them. They were not all automatically indexed to magic or magia. The herald's staff of Hermes signified his authority to mediate between gods and mortals, or to guide the souls after death. Though poets sometimes describe Hermes using it to lull people to sleep, that's no more magical than any other supernatural power that the gods routinely exercise. The thyrsus carried by the followers of Dionysus occupied a different symbolic space, embodying the ecstatic power of the god rather than any individual's magical skill. Now, Circe's Rhabdos does come closest to what modern readers imagine when we think of a magic wand, yet it seems unique to her, as in it's a Circe thing. Even Ovid, who makes so much of Circe's wand in the Metamorphoses, never gives one to Medea, the other famous witch who he features prominently in that text. So were ancient audiences capable of imagining wonder-working sticks? Absolutely. But were they a recognizable trope, like how a pointy hat today signals a wizard? No. Each ritual stick carried its own symbolic history tied to a specific divine or mythic context or figure. There was no single universal image of the magician's wand in Greco-Roman antiquity, only a constellation of rods, branches, and scepters, each performing different cultural work. Which means that an ancient Roman walking through the catacombs of Domitilla, looking at a fresco of Jesus raising Lazarus while pointing a stick, would not have instantly thought, ah, a magician. But what would have come to mind? Well, we get a striking hint just a few feet away on the exact same fresco. You see, I was only showing you one side of it. Zoom out and you see yet another figure just across from Jesus. Another man holding a small stick, pointing it toward a rock with water flowing out of it. This is Moses. The scene comes straight out of the book of Exodus. As the Israelites were wandering through the wilderness, they began to get thirsty and complained to Moses that God had brought them out of Egypt only to die of dehydration. Moses cries out to God, and God says to take his staff and strike a rock. When Moses does, water gushes forth, enough for everybody to drink. Now, when we think of the staff of Moses, we usually imagine something kind of hefty. A big stick, the kind you could lean on while walking or raise cinematically over your head over the Red Sea. But in late antique art, and actually all throughout art history, the staff of Moses is often shown as a surprisingly short stick. Moses wielding a little stick, barely the length of his arm, just like the object held by Jesus just a few feet away. So in this fresco, the artist is deliberately and quite literally drawing a parallel between Jesus and Moses. Although Jesus is not described as carrying a staff, Moses famously does, and it's repeatedly linked to miraculous power. Like how he throws it down before Pharaoh in a showdown against Pharaoh's magician and turns it into a serpent, or how he lifts it over the Red Sea and the waters part. That visual parallel seems to have shaped this artistic tradition of the wonder-working Jesus. If Moses performs his miracles with a staff in hand, then it makes sense for artists to place a similar staff in the hand of Jesus when he performs his own miracles. The scholar Lee Jefferson argues, the motivation of depicting Christ wielding a staff is to depict him as a wonder-worker similar yet superior to Moses. The staff marks him as a prophecy fulfilled. Christians often did link Jesus and Moses. The Gospel of Matthew, for example, goes out of its way to portray Jesus as a new Moses, with the Gospel writer filling the infancy narrative with references to the book of Exodus. Later church writers such as the church historian Eusebius explicitly links the miracles of Jesus with those of Moses. Moses may be called the first and only lawgiver of religion to the Jews, and Jesus Christ the same to all nations. Moses, again by wonderful works and miracles, authenticated the religion that he proclaimed. Christ likewise. Eusebius explicitly says what the fresco in the catacombs suggests visually. Jesus is cast as a new Moses. Just as Moses proved his divine mission through signs and wonders, so too did Jesus. St. Augustine picks up on the same theme. We read that the magicians of the Egyptians, men most skilled in these arts, were surpassed by Moses. But Moses himself and the rest of the most truthful prophets foretold Christ the Lord, and gave great glory to him. Jesus himself afterwards chose to work such miracles so that it would not seem strange if he did not do in person what he had done through them. This seems to have been a common way for early Christians to view Jesus, and from that standpoint, giving Jesus a staff in paintings visually links him to Moses. And in fact, the Moses staff tradition was not limited to Jesus in early Christian art. The Apostle Peter also gets portrayed as a mosaic figure with a rod in his hand. Peter with a staff shows up most often in funerary sculpture from the 4th century, where he's frequently depicted striking a rock to release water. This scene is not in the New Testament, but it does appear in the apocryphal Acts of Peter, where Peter, imprisoned in Rome, miraculously produces water by striking the stone walls of his cell in order to baptize his jailers. It's an obvious parallel to that story in Exodus with Moses striking the rock. So for a Christian audience in late antiquity, these images would not have suggested magic at all. They likely would have thought first and foremost of Moses. Having said all this, Jesus was never outside the realm of being accused of sorcery. Some of Christianity's earliest critics read the gospel stories and concluded that Jesus was a magus. The Greek philosopher Celsus, writing in the late 2nd century, claimed that Jesus had learned sorcery during his time in Egypt and returned to the Galilee using those skills to dazzle the crowds. He accused Jesus of practicing goetia and magia, which, as I mentioned, were terms that in Greek carried the clear sense of fraudulent, dangerous, and illegitimate ritual. Ancient writers used those words to sort certain kinds of ritual into the bad category. And I see something similar playing out today with these images. People online who want to score points against Christianity point to images like this and say Jesus was a magician, as if that makes him more ordinary or fraudulent. Meanwhile, apologists often do the reverse, insisting that the miracles of Jesus were categorically different from magic. But calling something magic rather than a miracle, or a miracle instead of magic, is never about the mechanics of the ritual itself. Ancient literature is full of figures doing supernatural or uncanny feats of power, or if we want to use the Greek word for wonders, thauma. Sometimes these wonder workers use words alone, sometimes they use touch, sometimes drugs, amulets, curse tablets, incantation bowls, or spit and mud as Jesus does in the Gospels. Ancient and modern audiences try to sort those wonders into the moral buckets of miracle versus magic, but that's more often a value judgment than a critical anthropological analysis. For example, think about Moses and his brother Aaron versus Pharaoh's magicians. In Exodus, both sides throw down their staffs, and both turn into snakes. The actions are identical, but one is remembered as a miracle and the other as magic. That difference is not in the mechanics of the act. Both of the sticks, after all, turn into serpents. The difference is in the meaning assigned by the storyteller and the audience. For the faithful reader, the distinction is obvious. Moses and Aaron act with divine sanction, while Pharaoh's magicians channel false or demonic power. Moses and Aaron's authority is legitimate because it comes from God, but for the historian or anthropologist, that's precisely the boundary we cannot take for granted. That's the value judgment I was talking about. From a critical perspective, both sides are performing similar ritual acts that different communities interpret through their own moral lenses. Our job as the critical historian is not to decide whose power is real or righteous, it's to understand how people construct those distinctions in the first place. Magic is not a stable cross-cultural category that describes a particular kind of ritual technique. It's a label that people, both ancient and modern, often use to draw moral boundaries between what counts as legitimate or illegitimate ritual. Calling one act magic and another miracle says less about the mechanics of the ritual itself and more about who's telling the story and how the audience is interpreting that story. And the same goes for wand. Wand is also not a stable cross-cultural category. It's a word we often use to mark a ritual stick as exotic, different, other, or magical. But sometimes a stick is just a stick, a tool that could appear in countless ritual contexts, whether in the hands of a prophet, a king, or a priest. And when we look at a painting of Jesus holding a stick and call it a wand, we're already importing our own assumptions about ritual legitimacy, our own categories of religion versus magic. But what assumptions were being brought to the table in antiquity? What was the cultural logic behind putting a stick in the hands of Jesus, Moses, and Peter, if not magic? The art historian Elżbieta Jastrzębowska argues that the short rod we see in early Christian art is not a magic wand at all, but a symbol of authority and power in Roman civic life. The virga. She writes, in the Roman representational art of the imperial era, a staff symbolized power, the virga virtutis, and was presented as a simple or decorative scepter in the hands of judges, procurators, consuls, and emperors. It was the same kind of rod a magistrate used during the ceremony of manumitio vindicta, which involved touching the shoulder of an enslaved person and declaring them free. In this sense, it symbolized lawful power and social legitimacy, and was precisely that kind of power that could be understood as miraculous or divinely sanctioned when placed in the hands of someone like Jesus. Building on that insight, the scholar of early Christianity Robin Faith Walsh compares Jesus' virga to another Roman symbol, the vitis, the vine-wood rod carried by Roman centurions. Initially, it was the centurion's beatstick, something you could use to whack disobedient soldiers. Though by the late Roman period, when these frescoes were painted, it evolved into a status symbol. Holding one in your official portrait said, "I'm disciplined, I'm honorable, I'm the kind of guy who commands respect." It appears everywhere in funerary art, in which elite Romans posed holding it as a sign of character and cultural capital. Dr. Walsh argues that when Jesus is shown with his own rod, artists were tapping into this same Roman visual language of power. In that light, the staff of Jesus, Moses, and Peter also echoes Roman sensibilities, a culturally legible emblem of power and legitimacy. So to bring this all together, Christian artists depicted Jesus holding a stick when performing miracles. So the stick does seem to signal wonder-working, but they would have simultaneously rejected the framework of magia. These are devotional images, after all, made by Christians for Christians. They would not in a million years say he was performing magia or goetia. The staff in the hand of Jesus was not meant to make him look like a magus, it was meant to make him look like Moses, another famous wonder-worker. But if Celsus would have walked by the exact same painting, he would have thought, a magus practicing evil magia. But he would not have made that judgment because of the stick, but because he was familiar with the exact same gospel stories as the Christian viewer. And the powers described in those stories could be construed within the cultural vocabulary of magia and goetia. Exorcisms, healings, prophetic insight, control over nature, even resurrection. In the eyes of a non-Christian polemicist, these were recognizable categories of supernatural performance, acts that might impress the believer, but for a critic could be easily accused as illegitimate. It's all about framing. A Christian saw a miracle and a critic saw sorcery. And that's exactly the problem we face today, with most of what we read online being framed through ideological bias. Something today's sponsor, Ground News, helps me navigate every day. Ground News is a website and app that gathers news stories from all over the internet and shows you how they're being covered across the political spectrum with tools like media bias charts, ownership data, and factuality ratings. It helps you step outside the echo chamber and understand how bias and framing shape the news we consume. For example, a few days ago, the US government shutdown officially became the second longest in US history, with Senate Democrats and Republicans stuck in a stalemate to reopen the government. Ground News has aggregated dozens of outlets covering this story. Here we can see well over half of those outlets are left-leaning and about a third coming from the right. Down here you can see the factuality and ownership charts, with the bulk of the outlets rated as highly factual and about half of them owned by media conglomerates. Ground News also enables you to compare the headlines. The right-leaning website Town Hall ran with this one: Schumer shutdown continues as Dems refuse to reopen government for 12th time, while the left-leaning Louisiana Illuminator simply notes the record-breaking length of time. Shutdown reaches day 22, second longest in US history with no sign of a deal. Same story, but Ground News helps you see the different framings. One of my favorite tools on Ground News is the blind spot feed. It highlights stories that are getting a lot of attention from one side of the political spectrum, but almost none from the other. This helps you quickly see what you might be missing in your own media bubble. So if you want to see how different sides cover the same story and spot the bias for yourself, head on over to ground.news/religionforbreakfast for 40% off their all-access Vantage plan. Again, that's ground.news/religionforbreakfast. Thanks, everyone.